Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Marketing Outlook Forum 2023. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sheila Flanagan, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Marketing Outlook Forum with my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Cook, who's with us today also. We're thrilled to have you here, absolutely thrilled, and thrilled to see so many of you in Euston this year. It's, we're building back up. We've had a difficult couple of years post-COVID, and it's fantastic to see so many first-timers with us this afternoon. And I was aware from the DMO breakfast this morning that we have new members and new Marketing Outlook Forum attendees. So to all of those who are first-timers, you're especially welcome to Marketing Outlook Forum. And for the old-timers, if you don't mind me calling you that, and I put myself in that bracket also, you're very welcome back, and it's great to see so many familiar faces back with us as well. So my personal wish for you all is that you have a fantastic conference this year, and that you both enjoy it socially and the networking element of it, but also that you gain something from the experience as well. As I've mentioned, we've had a really difficult couple of years, and tourism is recovering, happy to say. And again, this was mentioned at the DMO breakfast this morning. It's recovering at an uneven pace, and I think we'll hear a lot about that this afternoon. At 65% recovery in Europe and in parts of America, but really Asia maybe less so. So it's an uneven recovery that's happening. And also, of course, we've moved into, unfortunately, a global crisis with, and we all know we have high inflation, not just in this country, but also across the world elsewhere. Weak household spending as a result of that, which is impacting on our industry. And of course, in my part of the world, the war in Ukraine is having a major impact as well. And out of all of this, our industry reputation is at stake. During COVID, we lost a lot of people from the industry. They were fired. I think we all remember what happened when we came back, going through airports, the airport queues, the difficulties. People have been, it took a while to rehire. And it's also, we have challenges, and again, we spoke about this morning, challenges of retention of staff within the industry. So I think these are some of the areas that we'll be looking at over the next 2 days. Of course, we'll be starting with our good friend Adam Sachs shortly, whom I'm sure will be touching on some of this. We do listen to you, and your feedback constantly tells us we want more interaction, we want more opportunities to engage with speakers. So I think you'll see that reflected from the very first session this afternoon, but right throughout the conference as well. Also this year, you told us last year you liked the short segment on airlines. Well, we have a whole session on the airline industry this year. You told us you wanted more on digital marketing. I think that's also reflected within the program. And you also told us that you were interested in media purchasing, and again, that's reflected in the program. Not to mention on the final day, I think this will be of particular interest to the DMOs within the audience. We'll hear about the impact of TikTok on our businesses. We'll find out how DMOs are almost, becoming entertainers, or being forced into that role, and what can we do about it. As well as some new innovations within the program, we are bringing back the old favorites, and we have, as per normal, the accommodation sector, the international trends, which is always very, very popular, the sector and segment pieces as well. And one of the areas that you told us that you really like are the liqueur coffee breaks. So we do listen, and not only have we one liqueur coffee break this year, but we've doubled it, and we have 2. So do enjoy them. So I think, you're going to have a fabulous couple of days with us, and really look forward to engaging with all of you. And please take the time to both visit the vendors, our sponsors, and also to network, because that is the pure essence of the Marketing Outlook Forum. So, as we move in, and before I introduce our Houston host, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make that I've been asked by Kathy to bring to your attention. If you haven't already done it, please download the conference app. You can WOVA, I think is the correct pronunciation. I'm not quite sure, but even I am a technophobe, managed to get it working this morning, and it's great. You'll really enjoy it. There's also a QR code on the back of your lanyard, and use that when you're visiting with the exhibitors instead of your business card. And I think you'll find that it'll just make sure that you update your information on the app, and it'll be reflected within that. There are also two contests within the app. There's one for leaderboard engagement, and I noticed some of the DMOs just at lunchtime were way at the top of the leaderboard engagement as a result of this morning's session. And the other is a photo contest. So please take lots of photos and upload them, and there will be prizes for the winners who will be announced on Wednesday. And these contests are all being sponsored by AirDNA, so thank you for that. And indeed, thanks to all of our sponsors and supporters. As you know, we couldn't put this conference together without them. And then finally, in terms of announcements for now, our Wi-Fi network name is Arrivalist, in case you haven't already discovered it. And the password is Horizon, and that appears to work throughout the hotel. So, and again, thank you to Arrivalist for sponsoring the Wi-Fi during the conference. So, I hope you're enjoying Houston at this point, and before we move into the program proper, it's my pleasure to introduce our host for this year, Michael Heckman, and Michael is the President and CEO of Houston First Corporation, and Michael would just like to speak to you for a few minutes, so I'd ask Michael to come forward.
Well, what a great group. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Houston. Let me first apologize for making you come to this 75-degree weather in February. I know for some of you that was probably a very difficult thing to do. As mentioned, I am the President and CEO of Houston First Corporation. A little bit of background for folks that may not know us. We're a broad organization that primarily functions as our destination marketing organization here. We also manage and operate our convention center. We own one of our two headquarter hotels down at our convention district. We also operate many of our performing arts venues here in Houston. So we have a pretty broad set of responsibilities, but the thing that is our number one mission and job, and that is to promote Houston. You are here in our uptown area of Houston called the Galleria. Wonderful shopping. Please leave some of your money behind here if you want to go out and have some time to see some of the shopping. About 10,000 hotels in this part of Houston, just to give you a general sense of it. Houston is the fourth largest city, soon to be the third largest city in the United States. So we have a lot to be able to talk about and do as we get our message out for the things that we do. You know, we love any visitor that comes to Houston, any meeting that is here. We work very hard to be able to get that message out across the country and across the world. But I'm particularly pleased to have this group here because of the work that you all do. I can tell you that we use data analytics, insights daily for how we operate our business. So we're operating not only as a destination marketing organization, we're also operating facilities, and there's any number of analytics that we will look at on a daily basis. Cindy Decker, who has been involved in helping put this meeting together, is the Vice President of Business Analytics and Market Strategy for us, who is a key member of our executive team for the things that we do. I don't know that there was ever a more important time for this group and this organization for the work that you do than after COVID. How much bad information was out there in the middle of COVID and as we're coming out of it? How much bad information? Sweeping generalizations that turned out never to be true, right? but you all look at the numbers. You all look at the data. You know what was happening and what was going to happen. For any of us that are in our business, we had to project. We were looking at deficits as far as the eye could see. We had to talk to our boards of directors. We had to talk to our elected officials. We had to talk to our stakeholders, hotels. When's this ever going to end? What's it look like? And I can tell you that the reports that we were giving out were very different than what the news was telling people on a daily basis. Whether it be our airline partners or looking across the spectrum of the way that things ultimately were going to play out. Unfortunately, that I think colored it for a lot of people, which was, what's the hospitality sector going to look like in the future? Remember when people said that we would never eat at a buffet again, ever? Not for a year, ever. Never eat at a buffet again. Maybe never go to a sporting event again. So you all looked at the data and were poring over that, and I can tell you how much those of us that are in my position and other positions appreciated that, and the value that that provides for our industry and the things that we do. So I'm glad to see this room full. I'm glad to have you in Houston. I think it's terrific for you all sharing, collaborating, learning more about the things that we're doing. I can't wait to hear the report back out of what comes out of this week. We're happy to host you this evening. We hope you have a great time. Thank you for being in Houston, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you sincerely, Michael. And again, I think Houston First have been fantastic in terms of how they have integrated themselves into the planning of this conference, in particular Cindy, who served on our planning committee. So thank you for that, and thank you for your generosity as hosts, and just reminding everybody that tonight's opening reception is sponsored by Houston First, and the buses will start loading at 5:30, but more of that later. Now down to the main business of the afternoon. And as always, it's fantastic to have Adam Sachs open our event this afternoon. I'm thrilled to have him back with us. But in discussions with Adam this year, we tried to sort of kick this session around a little bit and do something different, and something that's maybe, no, he's not singing this year, but he has brought along with him, and we're absolutely thrilled to have John Leer from Morning Consult with us. John will be following Adam to the stage, and we are integrating or bringing together Adam's session with what normally follows, which is the demand side of the House piece. So they're going to do this piece collaboratively. So bear with us. It's something different, something new, something exciting, and there will be lots of opportunity for interaction. So in the first instance, I'll ask Adam to come forward, and then as the presentation progresses, he will be joined by John Leer. And John, thank you so much for being with us. So Adam Sachs.
All right, we're good. I was also managing something with one of my kids at the same time, so a lot of multitasking. Everybody's fine. All right. But my wife and I are both traveling, so we got to do what we got to do. All right. Hey, it's just so great to be with you. I actually was musing as we were thinking about the setup for this. Is like, I always know what year of TTRA Marketing Outlook Forum it's been, because my first one, I got a badge that said New Dad. And so this is my 20th, and so it's just to be together. You know, I just don't take it for granted, and it's so great to see all of you. So John and I are going to be tag teaming on this. So I'm going to share. I'm going to get you like 10 minutes of setup here. John Leer from Morning Consult is going to do a deeper dive on some of the consumer aspects that they're seeing in their survey data. And I just want to say, like, John and I had an opportunity to share a panel together last year, and I really enjoyed his perspectives. They're just the complement and maybe some contrast that we'll get into, because then I'll share some remarks after him. We're going to go back and forth. We're going to sit, we're going to talk, and then you're going to talk. All right, so we're going to just make this an interactive session. We're going to leave plenty of time for that. So, like, any fights you want to pick, like, just start gathering yourselves, like the things that you don't agree with or things you want to add is all fine. All right, we're going to make this fun. So, it's all big one rhetorical question. Can travel defy economic gravity? Well, that, of course, implies something about the economy, doesn't it? That there's some sort of downward push of gravity on the U.S. economy, and indeed, that is what we're seeing. But if I can point this towards something that, okay, great. But if you notice the jobs number that came out for the month of January, you would not see any gravity whatsoever. In fact, you'd see a lift. 571,000 jobs added in the month of January. All right, majorly overshooting expectations and significantly higher than we've seen over recent months. Now, there's noise in this data. I would not by any means counsel this to be considered a trend. We're probably going to see it be revised down. We're going to see it give up ground in the coming months as well. But to suffice to say, these are not the conditions you'd ordinarily associate with, like, the R word, right? You're looking at an unemployment rate of 3.4%. 53 years ago. That was the last time we were at 3.4% unemployment rate. But don't tell consumers that. They're still worried, right? So whether you look at the consumer sentiment or the consumer confidence index, they're both showing they've taken a hit. Now, some rebound, which is nice to see. But certainly there is this pervasive concern that you see in sentiment data right now. And why? Well, of course, it comes down to inflation. It is the main culprit behind the worries of consumers. And it's not direct. Some of it's indirect. But with the headline inflation right now, in the latest reading, 6.5% year over year, 5.7% on the core, netting out energy and food. Things are expensive, right? And in fact, the average household is now spending $400 a month more for the same goods and services now than they did 1 year ago. And therefore, the beatings will continue from the Federal Reserve, right? Another quarter percentage point just the other week. We're going to get more, right? The Fed cannot take its eye off the ball of reducing inflation. Why? Well, because it's insidious. It affects everything, and it starts by affecting purchasing power. If you look at disposable income over the last few years, you look at nominal rates, you're up 13% relative to where we were at the beginning of 2020. But once you net out inflation, we're actually break even. Exactly where we were in real disposable income in January of 2023 years ago. All right, and so, of course, inflation makes a big difference, and you're seeing it in some of the actual data. Retail sales have been falling in recent months. So it is real. It is having an effect. And households, as a result, are beginning to take on debt. So this is household debt, consumer credit, most of it credit card, taken on by income group. Now, first of all, shout out to the 1%ers for living within their means. But everybody else has been taking on some debt. I mean, actually, the lowest group is also doing well in terms of showing restraint. But everybody else, you just see this trend, right? People taking on more debt. So you start to get this picture of inflation having its effect on confidence, on income, on spending, and on debt. Right? That's the ground we just covered in the last few minutes. Therefore, right, this is the line of reasoning. Therefore, consumers will begin to retrench as we move to the latter part of this year. We think consumer spending is going to continue to grow. The first quarter is actually coming out pretty good, as far as we can tell. It's going to slow in the second quarter, go in reverse in Q3 and in Q4 of this year, which leads us to another piece of kind of where are we seeing the fault lines? The housing market. The housing market's already in recession. If you look at new and existing home sales, both of them considerably off their high marks. That's the effect of high mortgage rates, of course, right? You've got significant numbers of households that are just simply priced out of the market. And one more piece where we're seeing weaknesses in manufacturing. The manufacturing sector has also entered into, on a sectoral basis, a recession. Right? So particularly if you look at new orders, that's that blue, you can see that new orders for manufactured goods have fallen into contractionary territory. So as a result, that is another part. If you look at kind of where we're seeing the weakness, it's housing and it's in manufacturing. And therefore, leading to this kind of setup of what does gravity look like in this scenario. It looks like GDP falling in the third and the fourth quarters. 4% in Q3, 1.6% in Q4. For the year, if you look at the far right, these are the annual growth rates of GDP. GDP is going to be flat for 2023. But if you look at the peak to trough in the second half of the year, it's going to be down 1%. Why? We just talked about high inflation, aggressive monetary tightening, and then the spillover effects from the negative global, weak global economy, all of it weighing on consumers and businesses willing to spend. So how worried should we be? Well, before I bring John up, let me give this a little bit of perspective, just with one chart. Historically, if things play out the way that I've just laid out, this will go down as one of the weakest recessions, the most mild recessions that we've seen in recent history. If you go back, in fact, to post-World War II, a peak-to-trough decline of 1%, as we are expecting, would make it analogous to what we saw in 1991, a historically mild recession. Now, why do we think it's mild? Well, one, put it into perspective, in this scenario that Oxford Economics has modeled out, the unemployment rate goes from 3.4% to 4.7%. We're talking about a recession with unemployment rates sub 5%. So this is not an environment where you see mass layoffs. And why? Well, one of the reasons is that household balance sheets are still really strong. Second is that companies' balance sheets are really strong. And third, government balance sheets are really strong at the state and local level. And so the sort of over-leveraging that has caused recessions to be particularly severe in the past is not the environment we're in right now. So we're coming into this from a position of kind of fiscal strength at all three levels: consumers, companies, and state and local governments. So with that, happy to welcome John Leer to the stage to go deeper.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was insightful. I think a lot of what I'm going to say today is very similar, at least in tone, to what Adam brought up. You know, it's always hard to think about the right title for a presentation. Titles go a long way. Adam brought up this concept of gravity. We're in a travel industry here. I think talking about defying gravity is a challenging concept for the travel industry. Soft landing, another very challenging topic. You know, you don't want to talk about airplanes maybe not having a soft landing. So we've got a different title here, which is 2023 will test labor market resilience. But the basic concept is the same, which is, can the U.S., and particularly the U.S. consumer, withstand what I think are a series of headwinds? And Adam discussed a few of them. I've got a slightly different perspective, I think, particularly as it relates to consumers and consumer finances. So just by way of introduction, this is not just my views. There's a team of folks who are working on this. I'm John Leer. I'm the chief economist at Morning Consult, and our sort of secret sauce is we do 20,000 global surveys per day across 43 countries on a range of economic issues. That's what I analyze, and I have colleagues who do our brand data and our custom research as well. And this presentation is a reflection of our syndicated research pulling together sort of the greatest hits, if you will. So what are the big takeaways? I like to sort of front-run presentations and cheat a little bit. So the one thing I think I would want folks to take away from this is that we really see across the board pretty significant weaknesses on the consumer front, particularly as it relates to consumer finances. That consumers are not where they were in 2021 or 2020. And that sort of challenged consumer, that challenged situation among consumers makes them slightly more receptive to any potential downturn on the jobs market. And so that sort of takes me to the second point, which is even though we continue to see jobs as being very strong, the labor market extremely tight right now, for some reasons I'll outline later in the presentation, I think there are very good reasons to believe that strength will not continue over the course of 2023. And in fact, if it does, I think you'll see the Fed intervene in a pretty significant way. And then this last point is, assuming there's some sort of job losses, even as modest as Adam mentioned, the weaknesses that we see on the consumer front, I think, are likely to translate into pretty weak consumer spending. So I'm going to start with our sort of flagship data set, which is daily consumer confidence. We interview about 6,000 people per day in the US, tracking how consumers respond to all these different events. What we've seen over the course of 2022 was a pretty significant contraction in consumer sentiment. What's going on there? Well, we partnered with some researchers at the Cleveland Federal Reserve to try to figure out why exactly consumers hate inflation as much as they do. We're in a world of extremely low unemployment. So what's going on? Why is inflation as bad as it is? And the basic takeaway is that consumers don't expect to be made whole from inflation. They acknowledge that their wage gains will not fully compensate them for what they're losing on the inflation front. That differs a little bit by income group. Higher income folks tend to have a little bit more bargaining power. They're more likely to think that they're going to be made whole from higher levels of inflation. But that's the drag that is weighing on consumers. And in fact, we've seen that sort of sentiment improve recently, somewhat modestly, as inflation has stalled and started to fall. Of course, all consumers don't respond similarly, and there are really important demographic differences, particularly with age. I think that's been one of the defining features of the pandemic, in fact, is how important age has become in understanding how consumers feel, what's going on with their finances, and how they're planning on spending their money going forward. With older adults feeling particularly pessimistic, well, what's going on there? There's a couple factors. You've got a higher share of folks who are living on a fixed income. So inflation in a very real way is eroding their savings. They've got shorter time frames to make up whatever they've lost due to elevated inflation. And then something that maybe we forget is that folks who have experienced inflation before really know how terrible it can be and how challenging it can be for the Fed to get inflation under control. And then maybe the flip side is, we talked early on in this pandemic about a so-called K-shaped recovery. And everyone really highlighted the differences across income groups. And while that certainly is still the case, it's not as dramatic as it was then. That income groups increasingly are responding similarly. We'll see some sort of differences later in the presentation, but age really tells a pretty dramatic and an important story right now. And of course, the US is not operating in isolation. I think we've talked a little bit about the global reopening, what's going on here. We're seeing a lot of green out of Asia right now. The rebound in confidence in China is extremely impressive. I've got another paper out recently with folks from the San Francisco Fed highlighting just how valuable this data can be in understanding some of the PMI data and underlying economic activity indicators during periods of uncertainty. And so I think during this period of really intense policy changes, particularly the reopening that we're seeing in China, it can be challenging to understand what's going on with some of their underlying economic indicators. And everything that we see just suggests that the Chinese consumer is extremely optimistic, increasingly optimistic. Almost every day it feels like they're reaching new heights, despite the fact, of course, that there are very serious ongoing numbers of deaths and COVID cases over there. But the economic boom is very real and impossible to miss. If we sort of take a step back from how the consumer is feeling about the world generally and try to dive in a little bit to figure out, well, what's going on with their pocketbooks? And I think the data on the left, Adam showed some of that, and the data on the right here is Morning Consult's proprietary data. We can see that as it relates to savings and disposable income, consumers, as I said earlier, are not as well off. They simply do not have as much money, and I think that's important to note as we think about the future of consumer spending and then, of course, the future of the economy more broadly. And part of the issue, of course, is that every month their wage gains are not keeping pace with inflation. That was the story there early on as we showed sort of falling consumer sentiment. It makes it very, very difficult for consumers to keep money in their pockets that is going to finance their expenses. They're having to dive in, take on additional consumer debt, which I'll show you, and eat into the savings that they've accumulated over the course of the pandemic. To some extent, that can't last forever. At some point, consumers are going to have to either refill the savings that they're drawing down, they're going to have to repay their credit card balances, and presumably they're going to have to stop spending at rates that they have been. I think the income differences, although are really, really telling as well. If you see on this top line here, lower income adults are the ones increasingly who say that they are not able, that their expenses outpace their incomes on a monthly basis. It's not as much the case for those higher income adults, and we'll see down the road how that's affected some of their spending patterns. On the debt side, again, I think Adam mentioned this, and this is sort of similar. If you look on the left-hand side, we've got some data from the Federal Reserve. Consumer credit, both revolving, non-revolving, is about where it has been on a historical basis. We're not seeing people sort of take on crazy amounts of debt, at least on average. But if we dive in and we look at sort of the share of consumers who say that they have an increasing credit balance every month, that has been increasing pretty dramatically over the last year. And so there is really this question of how long that can last, that source of financing can last. In a world of low interest rates, it makes sense for consumers to take on a lot of debt. It's very cheap for them to repay that. As you start moving into this world of high and persistently high interest rates, all of a sudden the finances and the math doesn't quite work out. And so I think we haven't really seen this market crater just yet. As Adam noted, we've seen a lot of issues in the housing sector, concerns around the auto sector and other places where people have to take on debt to make those purchases. But this is something I think to watch, and it's going to be a drag, I believe, on consumer spending going forward. And in fact, we've seen this start to play out. So on the left-hand side, we've got the share of adults across income brackets indicating that their finances are worse than they were last month. That has been growing. And the right-hand side, we have spending, seasonally adjusted and inflation adjusted, look year over year by income group across the last few months. And that has been negative. So this is Morning Consult's proprietary spending data. We benchmark it to the personal consumption expenditures data and retail sales data as well that the government produces. And November and December were particularly challenging months for the U.S. consumer for all the reasons outlined above. That even though the narrative out there is that we've turned the corner on inflation, well, that's true, but in many cases that just means that the rate of price growth has slowed, that prices still are very high, and that wages are not keeping pace with inflation. So that will continue to be a drag as it was here in December across the income spectrum. Now these charts are maybe a little complicated, so stick with me for a second and I'm going to walk through them. So on the left-hand side, we are charting the line graph here is our consumer purchasing power barometer. So we ask consumers every month across all the categories that you see on the right-hand side, among people who were likely to go make those purchases, did they walk away because the price was too high, or did they trade down to a cheaper alternative due to those elevated prices? And we've seen at the end of the fourth quarter that sort of price sensitivity and that tendency to trade down started to increase, that consumers' purchasing power was being eroded. And I think going forward, that's something that's top of mind for us, is to figure out, again, not only are consumers buying or not, but also why are they not buying or why are they making a purchase. And that increasing price sensitivity is something that's likely, I think, to be persistent, again, despite the fact that inflation seems to be rolling over. On the right-hand side, we've got spending across a wide range of categories, and I think there's a couple things. For this group, obviously, hotels and airfare experienced a real boom in 2022. And there were two tailwinds there that many of you folks probably felt. One was the income effect, that we had folks in 2022 who had accumulated a decent amount of savings the last 2 years, and there was money in their pockets to spend. And then there was this sort of substitution or reallocation effect, that a lot of folks were unable, in fact, to travel. Business travel was canceled. A lot of hotels maybe weren't fully open. Vaccination rates were still low in 2021, my apologies. And so there was this shift, this reallocation, largely away from goods towards services. That was another boon to travel and airfare. If we look ahead as well, some of our own proprietary travel intent data shows that over the next 12 months, we continue to see higher income adults saying that they plan on traveling. And in fact, that travel intention has ticked up by about 10 percentage points from 2022 December from the prior year. So there clearly remains this pent-up demand to travel. I think Adam alluded to some of that. And we're really seeing that among high-income groups where, if you were sort of stuck with me earlier on, those are the folks who continue to have pretty strong finances. So that's all kind of I'll call that maybe a mixed message, and now I'm going to turn over and start talking about the labor market, which is positive, and I'm going to somehow manage to put a negative spin on it. So what's going on here? You know, jobs are crazy. I submitted these, I think, I was up very, very early on Friday. I think I submitted these an hour or two before we got our massive 517,000 job number for January. But the story basically holds true. And I think it's important to sort of, for all the unique features of this particular recovery, to sort of think about the different phases of this cycle and help situate where we are. And again, with all the data that we're seeing, a lot of the data revisions, just understanding where we are at any point in time is actually shockingly valuable. And so we had this clear shock. A lot of jobs were canceled. People were put on furloughs. Then all of a sudden, there was a dramatic rebound. We had another wave of COVID that hurt people. The vaccination recovery drove a pretty consistent jobs growth, really for the better part of a year. And for the last 3 or 4 months, we've heard a lot of news of elevated layoffs. I mean, that's been the story. If you go read the news outlets, you would think that we are in a recession right now. You would think that we're in a tech-led recession. But there's, of course, a couple things to note. First of all is that job openings remain very, very high. Second is that the tech sector accounts for a fairly small share of total employment. And so where we are right now is we're in this sort of worker reallocation phase, that there are companies that overhired, there are sectors that overhired, and they are being forced now in this world of elevated interest rates and more challenging financing conditions to justify that hiring, often by laying off workers who are almost immediately being reabsorbed to other more efficient, more profitable companies and sectors. And that's where we are right now. At least that's our sort of take on the current state of the employment cycle. So there's nothing wrong with that per se, but that move towards sort of greater efficiency, more concern around cost and workers, the return on investment, that's an early sign, I think, of companies and businesses being more prone to pulling back in the face of future uncertainty. And of course, I just highlighted all the reasons why I think there are some pretty serious concerns on the consumer front. In addition to this sort of broad macro narrative, there's of course very specific industry narratives going on. Again, tech being one of them. And this is every week we interview about 20,000 US adults across a range of industries to understand if they've lost pay or income. At a macro level, it's a good forecaster for weekly unemployment insurance claims. At a industry level, it provides a little bit more sort of depth and insight to understand what's going on. And folks in the tech and financial services sector, they temporarily experience elevated periods of pay and income loss, but they quickly retreat. And I think what we've seen over time is that it's the food and beverage sector that is more of a high turnover sector in general. They're the ones who continue to experience these pay losses. But really across all sectors, we're not seeing some sort of crazy escalation. There's no sign out there that, unemployment claims tomorrow or next week are going to miraculously double or triple. And in fact, I just looked at this week's data. It looks even more positive than midway through January. And so I think there remains pretty robust demand for workers right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that's unlikely to be the case going forward. Even as workers remain in high demand, these news narratives can play a very serious role in affecting how people think about the world and how they spend money. And we've seen this interesting phenomenon recently, which is that higher income adults now, for the first time in the last few months, are more likely to say they expect to lose pay or income over the next month than lower income adults. And again, a lot of these tech layoffs and media layoffs have been concentrated among white-collar jobs that pay a little bit more. Well, expectations in of themselves, of course, are not directly relevant, but if all of a sudden people forecast going forward that they're going to face tougher times, it becomes more likely that they reallocate some of that money away from consumption and back towards savings. And so there's I think a very real possibility out there that some of these sort of expectations become self-fulfilling prophecies, and you see higher income adults be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more price sensitive going forward as they're concerned about layoffs down the road. one of the sort of unique features, I think, of this current recovery has been just how many workers have been quitting. You know, we talked about the Great Resignation, we talked about quiet quitting. There are all these different phenomenon out there. The media loves to sort of label them as soon as they come out. What we're doing at Morning Consult is every day we talked about 3,500 employed adults across a range of sectors, and we asked them if they're actively applying for other jobs or if they're open to switching jobs. And a lot of the that active application activity has slowed in the tech sector. I think that's not surprising. These were sectors that benefited from folks spending a lot of time at home, a lot of time in front of a screen, a lot of advertising dollars devoted to the tech sector. As those tech valuations have started to fall, the layoffs and the layoff announcements have increased, all of a sudden it looks to us like there's sort of a sit and wait approach for those workers. And I think that's extremely important as we start thinking about this issue of wage growth, and I'm sure Adam and I will talk about that more, but wage growth remains too high for the Fed to feel comfortable taking its foot off the gas or brakes, however you want to phrase it, but essentially off of increasing interest rates. And so there is, I think, the need out there for workers to feel a little bit more uncertain, basically, in other words, and to try to provide some downward pressure on that wage growth, which in turn hopefully should reduce inflation. And then I'm going to just slightly sort of change gears here and talk. We've been talking a lot about workers. I want to talk about businesses and small businesses in particular. So it's our quarterly small business survey. We talk to 500 small and medium-sized businesses every quarter. What we saw in Q4 across the board was a smaller share of small businesses indicating an intent to invest. So they're not pulling back per se. It's not a contraction investment. It's a slowing in the rate of growth across a broad set of capital expenditures, and in particular hiring. So again, it's not, what we're not seeing here is small businesses saying that they're going to slow down, or sorry, that they're going to pull back on total jobs, but rather that they're going to slow the pace of hiring. You can see that here. So 36% of small businesses said they were going to increase headcount in Q3. That's down to 21% in Q4. We'll get the updated data here in a month. But there's this fear out there, and I think it's a very legitimate fear, that small businesses see that there's uncertainty out there. In the face of uncertainty, their gut reaction is to slow hiring, to wait to see how this shakes out. And so I'm going to play out, I think, a few scenarios here. Again, not using this term soft landing, but trying to think about what scenarios are most probable, and then, of course, there's sort of a follow-up exercise, which is thinking about how businesses can and should respond to them. So this world of steady growth I view as having extremely low probability. I think, you know, the 517,000 job creation that we saw, well, I don't believe that number for one point. And second of all, I think it's very unlikely that we miraculously start job growth accelerates. So I think this 2 and 3 are really where we're most likely to be headed over the next 3 to 6 months. And I think the most important point to note here is that we've saw weakening consumer demand. We continue to see inflation pressuring consumers' finances. Increasingly, we're starting to see businesses be affected by those higher interest rates. And I think the likelihood of higher interest rates paired with slower forecasts for demand are likely to manifest themselves in terms of a pullback in job creation later in the second quarter, which I think, as Adam alluded to, is likely to make the latter half of this year pretty negative. So I will pause there and let Adam come back up, and then we can dive in and answer questions. Thank you.
Well, John, you really know how to get a party started. Man, I'm going to try to pick this up. It's so depressing. But it's true. I mean, everything you shared, I totally agree with. But I'm going to come back to this question I started with and try to answer it. So given everything that particularly that John just shared, which is not especially hopeful about where we're headed in the coming year, what does it mean for travel? And then we're going to hash it out a little bit, all of us. And I have one point. Yes. But let me start what it usually looks like. If you look at the last 3 recessions, 1991, 2001, and 2009, you can get a sense for how travel usually responds to a recession. And the answer is badly, right? If in 1991, GDP fell by 1%, room demand, measured by SDR, fell by 4%, a 4x on the loss on GDP. Travel has always been elastic. It has grown faster than the economy when the economy is doing well. It has fallen much further when the economy has done poorly, and many of us have lived through more than a couple of these. In 2001, the relationship was more severe because of 9/11. It was a mild recession, but a very severe drop in room demand of 7% from the peak to the trough during the recessionary period. 2009 was unique because, well, it was the most severe recession of our lifetimes in terms of the duration and depth of it, 4% drop in GDP and a 9% drop in hotel room demand. So we're looking ahead at the rest of this year, and you might reasonably ask, should we just pencil this in? I already said we're forecasting a 1% drop in GDP in the second half of the year, so should we rightfully think that room demand is going to fall by 4%? I don't think so. And I'm going to share with you a handful of reasons why. Why I'm here to tell you I think the travel industry can and is very well positioned to defy economic gravity. First, U.S. households are in a position of strength. And I'm going to go back on some of the things that John and I looked at already and give you a bit of a different lens on some of the same data to make this point. Let me start with debt service. So we've been talking about, okay, people are taking on credit card debt, and we saw that even by income group. The question is, how much does that debt cost? How much does it cost to service that debt month by month as a share of income? And in the latest data, that's at 14% of income. Just focus on the left side. That is a good bit less than it was in the last downturn, the true recession of 2008-2009, when it was 18%. Equally, on the asset side, household net worth, so this isn't, and I'm going to get to this isn't just the additional savings that were amassed and how much of that has been drawn down over the last couple of years. This is a total. This is how much are households holding in net worth. And while it's come down, it's certainly historically high and still following. If you just draw a line through that little mountain, you're still on trend. And so whether I look at the liability side or on the asset side, households are actually in a good spot to weather something of a storm. And again, if you look at how much savings, John, you showed the savings rate trend. And what you probably remember is that it spiked up hard right during the pandemic, the teeth of that. So the fact that it's come down, people are drawing down that savings, begs the question, how much is left? Not what is the savings rate right now, but given how much was saved over the last few years, after we've already drawn some down, how much we got left? Well, we got about 1.5 trillion left is the answer. Incremental savings above where we were 3 years ago. So even though that savings rate's very low, there's still a lot of money in the bank, and it's especially true for high-end travelers. And this is a key part of what I think gets us through over the coming year. Because when you look at where those excess savings reside by income group, you can see, yes, it's been drawn down a lot in that top 25% of income earners, but they're still holding $600 billion in additional money that they didn't have 3 years ago. And it's a very different entry point into a recession than we've had in past recessions. And the same would be true, particularly of that third income quartile, a significant amount of savings in the range of $400 billion that remains in accounts to enable households to keep going forward. Host, in their November earnings call, pointed this out. Said, while macro concerns continue to dominate the headlines, we're not seeing any signs of weakness in our business. Why? Consumers still have significant excess savings. The number then was higher, so I just said significant, with the majority concentrated in the top income brackets, which gives us confidence the recovery in the lodging industry is sustainable. Why? Because most of our travelers are in those groups. You might say, well, what's the distribution of households across those groups? That doesn't matter. The question is, what is the distribution of travelers across those groups? And they concentrate heavily in that top 25%. Now, let's talk about inflation. We'll talk about what a damaging phenomenon is. But here's, I'm here to provide you forecasts. I mean, I'll be here next year. And I'll give you new forecasts. But our forecast right now is inflation is going to keep coming down. Right? It has been coming down already, and it's going to continue. Why so bold a prediction? Well, one is because the effect of the Federal Reserve in its intent at demand destruction, yes, that is something it's doing intentionally, is working. And we are seeing wage growth begin to moderate. That's a really important decoupling. If we saw wage growth, especially in this very tight labor market that we're in, continuing to accelerate, we would be very worried that we're not going to be able to find an off-ramp on inflation. But because we're seeing wages begin to decelerate, that's one of the key drivers of inflation, one of the reasons that we think that we're going to continue to see this trend that we're already on. One more reason is, isn't it good not to be talking about supply chain issues? And indeed, supply chain issues are very much a thing of the past. In fact, deflation in those sectors that were affected by supply chain issues has decelerated massively. And if you look at one indicator, the cost of shipping, you don't even need to look at the details. You can see how far shipping costs have come down because those supply chain constraints have abated so much. One other point on inflation, airfares. Look, so many, we're all like, oh, it's so expensive to fly. It is, right? But let me point this out. I have a couple of points here. One is you're going to note that airfares, actually, if you compare it to overall CPI, and trend is lower than overall CPI. All right? I mean, don't tell your friends when they're trying to book a summer holiday, but that's what it is on the total. The other thing of note is that it's down. It's actually fallen 19% from its peak in the spring of 2022. So why does it feel so expensive? Well, it feels so expensive because it's still 29% higher than it was a year ago, right? And so there's a lot of psychology there when we start to book flights. But nevertheless, we can say amongst us researcher people, no one cares when they're booking their flights, but we can say that actually flights are not as expensive as the rest of the basket of goods and services in terms of increases over the last few years. So, position of strength, the household. Second, pent-up demand and prioritization of travel. I mean, you know, if you know me at all, you know that when someone says new normal, I try not to roll my eyes out loud. All right? But if we were to venture forth some sort of legacy of what we've been through over the last few years, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that we love travel more. And perhaps there is this enduring legacy of the prioritization of travel that is still ahead of us. And I think there's data that supports it. Let's start with consumer spending. And I'm hoping that John and I can talk a little bit about this. Because John showed that December data of the bar charts, the bar chart with you notice all the ones at the top, right? Hotel, air, gas, right? At the bottom was goods. And that matters. If you look at what's happened over the last few years, spending on goods has risen much faster than spending on services. You can see durable goods are 25% ahead of where they were in February 2020. Non-durable goods up 11%. Service is only up 4%. Of course, that's where travel is. Here's the point, and I think this matters. Before the pandemic, consumers spent about 70% of their income on services. Right now, it's 66%. And so even if you just say, we're going to get back to where we were, that gives us quite a bit more headroom for the shift from goods to services. And I shared with you earlier that we saw retail spending fall. Well, that was all part of my negative part of my talk. The fact is that spending on services has continued to rise, and that even as you've seen plateaus and falls in the spending on goods, we've seen the spending on services continue to rise. And Delta's CEO in October points this out, said global demand is continuing to ramp up as consumers shift spending to experiences. I was talking about business travel returning and international markets reopening, which we'll get to. Longwoods backs it up, right? Their latest survey, you should be on this mailing list every couple of weeks. 91% of travelers say they have traveler plans in the next 6 months. So if you're looking for kind of travel intent data and you're like, I'm trying to see where it falls off somewhere out in the future. You're not going to see it in this chart. Still about as high as it's been since they've been running the survey over the last few years. But, and this is where we come full circle, if you look at MMGY's portion of the American traveler, you do see a drop-off, and you see it in lower-income households. So where we see resilience in intent to travel, and by the way, this is all consumers, whereas Longwoods is travelers. That's why these are lower percentages. But you see the resilience in these higher-income households, but you see the drop-off in those making less than $50,000 and even those making less than $100,000. But the skew of travel incidence toward the higher end levels that out. Now here's one other piece from Longwoods, and I don't want to say new normal, or don't want to say it, but this is kind of new, and it might be normal. All right. 34% of respondents in Longwoods survey said they plan to travel while they work. All right? This is not, I'm going to travel for work. This is, because I can work anywhere, I might as well do it somewhere nice. And you see it in different categories. I plan to work remotely away from home in another U.S. location for 1 to 4 weeks, or in multiple locations over the next couple of years, or at another U.S. location for 4 or more weeks. These different categories, or even internationally, 7%. If you add it up, a full 1/3 of travelers say they're going to travel while they work. Was this happening 3 years ago? Well, if I look back at Longwoods data, what it was maybe 6 months ago, it's increased significantly. It was in the 20s. And so it's actually ramping up. And take it for what it's worth. United CEO said there's been a permanent structural change in leisure demand because of the flexibility that hybrid work allows. It's not pent-up demand. It's a new normal. I'm just reading as a new normal. Third, businesses are continuing to restore necessary travel. And this is where, if you can think about a tide of the economic tide going out, the business travel tide is still coming in. And indeed, we're seeing that in the data. The latest survey that we run with the U.S. Travel Association through J.D. Power in airports finds that business travelers in the fourth quarter of 2022 increased their intentions to travel for business relative to 2023. So this is while we're starting to build worries about the economy in the fourth quarter, business travelers saying, my intentions have actually increased since the third quarter of this year. So, and interestingly, that 101% means that over the next 6 months, they plan to travel more, slightly more than they did in the same period in 2019. And it's especially strong in conventions and trade shows, 110% of that 2019 level. Also strong in customer. Where do we see things still pulled back? Internal meetings. All right? Internal meetings are lame anyway. So, not much lost. All right. Delta, just a couple weeks ago, said consumer demand remains healthy, with advanced bookings significantly ahead on both yield and load factors for each month of the March quarter compared to 2019. And our recent corporate survey results were positive, with 96% of respondents expecting to travel as much or more in Q1 than Q4, led by financial services. So they're seeing it in their booking and in their survey data. And here's something to celebrate. Actual air travel in the month of January, for the first time, exceeded the levels of travel demand in the same month in 2019. We did it. Air travel fully recovered. Right. Listen, if you flew in the spring of 2020, and you felt like you were in the apocalypse, right? It was just you and your dog walking through Terminal E in Philadelphia. You know how incredible this is. Additionally, a survey from North Star finds that in December, acceleration from meeting planners who say this is 67% of meeting planners expect to plan more in-person meetings in 2023 than in 2022, up from 59% in the third quarter. Marriott, this is a little old, but I think it still matters because it talks about sort of the pent-up demand on the group side. In September, they said that their third quarter data were showing they were up 30% in bookings for groups for all future events relative to the same period in 2019. Right? There's no new normal when it comes to meeting face-to-face. And fourth, and then I'm almost done stacking up my reasons, is international. International is also continuing to rebuild, and economic weakness will not reverse that trend in the coming year. Now, let me point out that outbound, U.S. outbound, has already fully recovered. If you look at overseas, in the month of December, it reached that watermark of the same number of outbound trips in December of 2019. And Middle East and Africa, 26% ahead. Latin America, up, that it does include the Caribbean, up 12%. Asia, 70% of 2019 levels. So outbound's already recovered. And, of course, you know that represents leakage for what's happening here in the U.S. So what's happening on the reverse side? Well, inbound is gaining momentum. It's not there yet, of course. Total overseas in the month of December was at 70% of 2019 volumes. But Canadian visits to the U.S. almost fully recovered in the month of December. And what else do I got? The world, 77%. So including Canada, Mexico, and overseas, almost 80% fully recovered in the month of December. And our expectation is this continues. Particularly if you break it out by region, you begin to see some of the upside, particularly on Asia Pacific. Now, we don't expect Asia to come roaring back, right? But could we get to 75% recovered in the coming year from Asia? Absolutely, right? And it may take a couple more years after that to get fully recovered. But that is continuing to fill things in as we move forward. And this is why this is very different than what we've experienced in past recessions, because you're seeing a continued recovery, counter-cyclical, if you will, relative to what's going on in the economy. American, just a week ago, said this is our best ever post-holiday booking period with broad strength across all entities and travel periods. Demand for domestic and short-haul international travel continues to lead the way. We expect a strong demand environment to continue in 2023 and anticipate further improvements in long-haul travel international this year. So let me wrap up, then we'll talk. All right, look, we think a recession's coming. Could we dodge it? Yes. But if we hit it, it's likely to be mild. The effects of inflation, interest rates, the areas of downturn we've already seen in manufacturing and housing, the fact that consumers are taking on debt, they are worried, all of that begins to pull the economy to a point where it pulls back in the second half of the year. But we think that the balance sheets of corporations, of households, and state and local governments will help to mitigate that downturn. Let me add one more thing of what will mitigate it, which is that there are about 5.5 million people unemployed right now in the U.S. That's what that 3.4% unemployment rate means. 5.4. There are 11 million job openings right now. And so you can imagine that as we hit a downturn, companies are not just going to be laying people off, they're going to be pulling those openings as well. And that's one of the reasons that the effect on unemployment rate, it will be so relatively modest as we see it transpiring in the coming year. Okay, so nevertheless, we think travel is here to stay. We think it's going to actually muscle through this because of the fiscal position of households, because of pent-up demand, because of business travels coming back, and because international doing the same. Let me end with just a couple charts, and I keep telling you I'm about to end. I can't help it. All right, this is really it, though. Hotel room demand is in recovery territory, as in fully recovered territory. Month of December, official data, it was up at 1% ahead of 2019. Our estimates for January is at 1.7%. And so the bold declaration is that we think growth can continue even amidst all of this. And here's another reason why. If you look at hotel room demand compared to GDP and go back to the year 2000, you can see they move really closely together. They always find each other, right? They may decouple, but then they find each other again. The real growth in the economy does tend to track the real consumption of actual hotel room nights. Where we are right now, even though we have fully recovered, the number of rooms sold is well below where we are in terms of the growth in U.S. gross domestic product. And so all I am saying in this radical thesis that travel can continue to grow in the coming year is that it's going to continue to make its way up to what the old normal was relative to GDP. All right. And therefore, truly it, 1991 recession, shared with this earlier, about a 4% drop in GDP. With the same drop in GDP in the coming year, we actually spent, for the full year, about a 2.5% increase, but for that second half of the year, still a 1.8% increase in room demand. Much softer than it was last year. I mean, last year we were still reclaiming ground. Room demand year over year in 2022 grew 11%, right? So don't think I'm saying, the party just continues at the same rate, but we continue to grow. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it until we're together next year, and I gotta own it. All right, so that's all we got prepared. Now we get to talk. And John and I have a couple things that we're gonna just start to talk about. But then how do we hear from y'all? We got mics. Okay, we do have mics in the back. So we're gonna get that going too. So John, I've done plenty of talking. Let's just start by talking about consumer confidence, because you have a measure, Morning Consult, of measuring sentiment and confidence. There's University of Michigan and Conference Board. How important is that? Like how people feel versus the way they actually behave?
Yeah. So I'll talk about that, and then I might dive in and talk about some areas where I disagree with your presentation and where we agree. So I think during periods of elevated uncertainty and market volatility, high-frequency data is extremely important, and the confidence data tends to be released before you get a lot of the hard data, and in particular, then sort of moving from a monthly, let's say a monthly Conference Board survey or monthly Michigan survey to a daily Morning Consult survey becomes extremely valuable, and that's in fact the sort of I guess the genesis of this working paper we recently released with folks at the San Francisco Fed is just how important it is to have that high-frequency global data when you can't always trust the government data because it tends to be released with a lag. So that's sort of part of it. I think the other point to note is just directionally it can be extremely valuable, particularly when things turn south. So very quickly you see consumer confidence fall when when folks are being laid off, and that shift doesn't always show up in the unemployment rate until a few quarters later. So for the high frequency tracking, it's very, very valuable. And then I think there's also just some level of sort of interpretation required as well to understand, looking at change over levels, realizing that confidence is an indicator. It's an input into a model. It's not everything, but it can be a very timely indicator.
Mm-hmm. But in the summer of 2022, consumer confidence fell like a rock.
Yep.
Right? Gas prices, right? But it didn't really affect anything in the real world. Just people were worried.
Well, I think that's when you started to see consumers draw down on their savings. And so, in my head, I've got a little model where they're spending on the left-hand side, and you've got savings and income and unemployment and a few other indicators, and confidence is one of them. And that helps track some of those changes that you mentioned. I think the other thing to note is just making sure that you're looking at real spending and not nominal spending. So what we've seen over the last, the end of 2022 was negative real consumer spending, negative real retail sales. And that's really what you're picking up on that confidence data.
Yeah. So it matters. It's just you don't want to put too much weight on it.
I would think it's like a lot of economic data or data in general. It's something, not everything. And it's important to know how you interpret the data.
Okay. And where do you disagree?
Where I disagree with you? There are a couple things. I think mostly we agreed. I looked at your summary points, and while the tone maybe was different, I think we had a lot of areas of convergence. It felt like probably in both of our conversations there was sort of the elephant in the corner that was missing, which is talking about the Fed. And so my sense is, you talked about households' net assets and their net worth. I think we've all been surprised at how well financial conditions have held up despite higher interest rates. In fact, despite what Chair Powell said recently, they have weakened or they've loosened, not tightened recently. And my sense is that the Fed is going to have to be more aggressive in raising interest rates to try to get financial conditions under control, and that will directly erode some of the household wealth that you mentioned. So that would be one point. And then I guess maybe on this reallocation point, I guess I'm a little less optimistic that we will continue to see a reallocation away from goods towards services. I think we saw a tremendous amount of that reallocation in 2022. There might be some additional sort of residual, but I don't think that 2023 will look anything like 2022, where there's really a dramatic change in where people are putting their money.
But, hold on, I'm almost there. But they have radically changed.
Yes.
That's the thing that I'm sort of stuck on, is that if you look at the last few years, there's been this remarkable increase in what people spend on goods, right? Whereas services is just kind of broken through. So if there's not going to be a continued convergence, then that means that there's a permanent actual restructuring of the way that people spend the money toward goods.
Yeah, and I would say, again, maybe to not use the dreaded term, but
Yeah.
that to some extent reflects the new normal, which is where are people spending a lot of their times. They continue to spend a lot of time at home. They continue to work from home. That pretty dramatically shifts where people are spending their money.
Yeah.
And again, it's not to say that there's maybe not additional room, but I think 2022 we saw the rapid rebound and bounce back, and I wouldn't expect that growth rate to continue going forward.
Right.
And it maybe that's the sort of the nuance. It's a difference between thinking about growth and levels.
Right, for sure. We could take a break if there are any questions. John and I could talk for a while, but yeah.
Hi, great presentations for both you guys. Speaking about consumer confidence, John, you gave a few different reasons why. I thought that age graph was really interesting, how there was such a divergence between the younger audience and or younger consumers and older consumers. I know Morning Consult does work with politics as well. Is that connected to politics at all? Because we know the consumer sentiment completely often flips with some folks whenever there's a new president in the White House or whatever. Is people consume different information? Is that tied in? Or even if you control for that, is there a big difference based on age? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question and something that we get a lot, which is this not just measuring people's political sentiment? And I think it's clearly important, and I think actually you summarize it really well, which is that when you're trying to understand what consumer confidence means for the economy, it's the trend that matters more than the level. And that you see during elections, you see essentially a switch in people who were optimistic, they immediately become pessimistic, and people who are pessimistic become optimistic. And after that period of sort of transition is over, the trend essentially converges and reaches the sort of pre-election trend. And so I think it can be very helpful in understanding why people at a given point in time have a certain view of the economy. But if you're trying to use consumer confidence to understand where the economy is, I think just by looking at something like a percentage change, you've basically netted out the impact of politics.
Yeah.
Hey, I've heard a lot of economists speak in the last couple of years, and everybody's pretty much agreeing with each other, which is always a good sign. But on the issue that you guys were just talking about related to the shift from goods back towards services, in fact, actually two people I've heard speak about this, they both bring up the point that we have like 30 years of data that show that it's weighted more towards services than goods. And so I do think that probably is an indicator that it is going to rebalance itself, like Adam was saying. I don't know if it's going to keep us in the positive realm this year in terms of travel. Hopefully it will, but I tend to agree with them that say we are going to go back to that kind of long-term trend of that.
I've always really liked Dundalk. Yeah.
I think that's very possible. Maybe one thing, again, to sort of connect these two is to think about spending allocation and the Federal Reserve, which maybe those are not always next to each other in people's heads. But the concern that we have with inflation is that while headline inflation has turned over, goods inflation, it looks like it's turned over, services inflation, excluding housing, remains persistently elevated. And that is really what Chair Powell and I think others are focused on. And it's hard to see a world where where you're able to get sort of services inflation under control without reducing some of the wage pressures in the services sector. And that, in turn, I think, is a function of slowing demand for services. And so, to some extent, I think about this as a range of possible outcomes. If services spending just remains gangbusters, I think that's where you're going to see the Federal Reserve come in and act extremely aggressively, doing anything it can to try to bring that down. So part of that is just sort of maybe an outlook that's conditioned on a policy response.
Yeah, and actually, I totally agree with you, because if you break out the CPI by category, goods prices actually have come down, where services prices have been very, very stubbornly high. And those of you that are tracking average daily rates for hotels see that. And so that, we've actually never seen the travel industry have so much pricing power on the lodging side as it's had over the last few years. And it is that stubbornness that is actually one of the reasons that spending on services has probably held in a way that we haven't seen on goods, is because prices have held so strongly. Okay. Yeah, we've right here in the front.
I have a question on that front. On the pricing power for hotels, one of the questions that comes up the most here in Houston is the pricing of hotels. What percentage of our rate is really mistaken for ADR growth because our mix of business is down? Houston is a highly business-driven city, and business rates are usually discounted. And so nationwide, how is that being affected, or what are y'all's thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, so because leisure transient tends to command higher rates, the fact that that has led the recovery and now represents a larger share of overall demand, that would support overall rates. And that is absolutely a factor. I don't think it's the dominant factor. It is one of a set of factors. I get to meet with a group of hotel revenue managers nationally once a year and do sort of it's like 80 of them from different brands, different parts of the country, and talk about like what they're seeing on the revenue management side. And for the last couple of years, I try to draw from them, why are you able to charge so much? Like, this is like, I ask it exactly like that. And the answers that I've gotten are really illuminating. One is that they just say their revenue management software is better. So they actually they just have better systems for it. Another is that when, and this is actually a little bit amusing, is that when the pandemic hit and there were layoffs, they actually laid off revenue managers and let the software do what it was supposed to do. And so, they're very circumspect about it, but less panic, right? Less, I need to cut rates. And particularly, during the downturn, there was a wide recognition that cutting rates wasn't going to do anything. And so there was more resilience there. And then the other piece to it that I think is perhaps the biggest piece is that the cost of running a hotel has gone up so much, right? If you look at the wage cost for hotel employees, it's gone up significantly more than almost any other sector. And of course, all of the energy prices, everything else that flows into the cost of doing business. And so that is introducing a level of discipline on pricing because below certain rates, you're not going to make any money. So I think it's all of those things. I do think it's the mix, and leisure is obviously driving higher rates. But it's also some of these more very internal sorts of phenomena. Yeah, a couple in the middle. John, did you want to add anything? Sorry.
No, that was excellent. Maybe I would add, it's interesting, on the consumer front, we have seen very limited price sensitivity. So if we go ask consumers, how likely are you to walk away from a hotel booking because the price was too high, that really hasn't spiked. It's not nearly what we see in some of these other categories, even on the services side, even in the discretionary services side. So there seems to be, again, to your point, some pricing power there.
So I'm going to challenge your central premise. January jobs report, even if that isn't, the 560K that we saw last week, even if it goes down to something ridiculous, like 200,000 jobs in January, if that gets revised downward, that's still a really strong jobs report versus expectations. Plus, we saw November, December job gains get revised upward. We're seeing real wage growth in manufacturing and construction. Like you guys pointed out earlier, consumer confidence is pretty closely tied to gas prices. Is this more of an everything sucks but I'm fine deal instead of, a full-blown recession. Q1 GDP looks like it could be kind of strong, especially with auto sales and Social Security adjustments kind of coming into play here in Q1.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what the question was there. There was a lot of statements.
So is it just people saying everything's bad out there, but I'm fine?
Yeah.
Is that sort of the phenomenon that you're seeing?
I don't think so. I think similar to what we showed, inflation is more than, I think consumer confidence, first of all, is more than gas prices. We see it also being reflective of stock prices and a few other measures. Inflation has been very corrosive as it relates to people's views of the economy. We saw that show up, first of all, in the sentiment surveys, and then it translated into their household balance sheets. I think what's surprising is this disconnect between how people feel about the world and their economy and then the jobs market. And that has been the disconnect, and that's, I think, what I tried to show in this presentation, which is that as long as jobs growth remains, it doesn't even have to be crazy. Let's call it 150, 100,000 jobs created per month. That will wash over a lot of these other sins on the household finances side of things. The challenge becomes that I just don't think the U.S. economy is quite as resilient as it was in 2022 and 2023. And in the absence of that source of income, which is what most folks use to pay their expenses, I think you're likely to see a pretty dramatic pullback in spending.
It's an insightful question because what you're pointing out is that a lot of the key metrics are still really good for the U.S. economy. Yep. And so what I think what you're hearing a lot from the likes of us and getting amplified in the media is worries about where does this head, right? And so people are actually trying to basically anticipate a turn, which is really hard to do, by the way. Like to time, like forecasting the point at which the economy actually changes direction is very luck dependent. Like to actually
and lucrative.
Yeah, right. So there is a bit of like everything is fine now, but you do see like all the things that John just mentioned being you're just like putting on more and more weight on to the economy, or I should say that the headwinds continue to stiffen, right? And so the assumption is that when you combine all of things together with debt and interest rates and where disposable income is, that eventually it does reach a breaking point as you get to the second half of this year.
Right here. You got one more. Right behind you. Hi. My question is, so we're expecting the economy to slow mostly due to the Fed policy and tightening. What are we expecting to happen in Q3? Do we think that the Fed, once it gets inflation down, they're going to reverse course? Like, what's going to get us out of the potential recession?
Do you have a baseline? I can show.
So I would say my baseline is, it rarely happens, but I would say I strongly disagree with how financial markets have interpreted Chair Powell. I think that the Fed is likely to keep interest rates high through 2023. I take the Fed basically at their word right now. A lot of that is the service sector, excluding housing inflation. It's going to be very persistent, challenging to get that down. I think one of the unique situations where we are in right now, and I think Adam's presentation highlights this, is that in a normal recession, what you're looking for is you kind of are looking for that recession to clear out some of the imbalances that existed. It oftentimes takes the form of excess leverage. It's hard to see that right now. There really aren't too many pockets of crazy leverage. Maybe housing prices were a little crazy. But it's one of the reasons I think that it's very likely that we've come out of the recession in fairly short order without significant contraction or prolonged contraction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, just say that I do think the Fed's going to need to reverse course by the end of this year. I think they're going to overshoot. They're still likely. I'm with John. We're not done raising interest rates, but it's February, and so very likely another hike. everybody thinks there's going to be another hike this month, and almost certainly in March as well, right? But as we get to the latter part of the year, if things play out the way that we've sort of modeled it out, which is that the economy does begin to contract and inflation does come down into moving quickly toward 2% by early 2024, you basically get the Fed pauses in the second half and then actually could very well begin to lower rates in early 2024. Okay.
I'm not sure if this is the right question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I'm in a destination where it's a lot about leisure business. And when you talk about recovery for the business sector, we're noticing that the rate that's driven on leisure is now driving up more cost on the business side, which is a challenge. And we're starting to see some of the businesses either go to another destination or, frankly, we don't want to have the conversation with our industry to say your price is a bit high right now.
Mm-hmm.
So any thoughts on that when you talk about business and recovery?
Sure. I mean, yeah, certainly at the destination level, you can have some substitution there. I mean, I think nationally, business travel is pretty inelastic when it comes to rates. And so I'm not especially worried about rates at a national level affecting the business travel recovery. It's just more on that local level. And also, right? We can't tell our hoteliers, we need you to help this group out. They're all about maximizing their profits, and good for them. And so, that in some cases that means that you will have to say goodbye to business you'd love to bring in, but the leisure market's crowding it out. I see Donna Karen.
Let me stay on the destination level for a minute and talk about the variables that you were putting up: age, household income, particularly to you, John, changes in actual behavior, where people are going, how long they're staying, what they expect from this experience. We hear all the time on the destination level that this isn't even a new normal. This is some kind of chaos out there that we don't understand. The Gen Z, it's not only that they don't want to come into the office, what they're doing when they're traveling, how they're spending money. Where in, not so much the modeling data yet, but when he's got something good, can you put it in the model for the destinations?
I mean, John and I are close, becoming very fast friends, and I'm sure.
I think she just proposed a joint venture, which is maybe a first here.
Right, it just happened.
I'll volunteer New York.
Yeah. We have. Well, I would say so. Generation has been extremely important. It was important early on during the pandemic, particularly because health risks were so different. So people were responding very, very differently by age, and then inflation has just sort of magnified those generational differences. I have to be a little careful. I have a colleague who's our travel analyst, so I don't want to sort of take her work and pass them off as my own. But we have seen in some of the research that she's done just how differently generations are thinking about travel, what they're looking to get out of it. And then on the price sensitivity front, we've seen as well that younger adults have grown particularly price sensitive in ways that older adults haven't as it relates to travel. And so I think I tend to tie things back to money and spending. That's sort of all roads lead to money and spending. I'll let Adam chime in if he's got additional feedback. But I do think it's important probably, especially during periods of rapid change, to have that model, but then also to contextualize it with a narrative.
Yeah. I think it'd be fascinating to layer some of your generational sentiment stuff on top of, travel by generation and
I'm in.
and actual travel again. All right, so we'll be back at some point. All right.
Well, I have it.
Okay.
I've got the mic.
Oh, Wendy. Yeah.
I have it. So when I looked at your charts where you tracked hotel demand increases to other recessions and how they track together the GDP, and it's on a national level, so it's an average. And would it be a fair statement to say in the past, the recovery by market and by hotel type pretty much across the board. Whereas this time, the recovery has been so uneven and so different, market by market, hotel segment by segment, to be able to look at that number to say how it's going to track to the GDP is like, okay, that's a national level and could be meaningless to your market because your recovery pace is nowhere near, or you well exceeded the GDP so far. Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say this time, or are we entering new territory?
I think it's still really meaningful. And the reason is that, when we think about like what are the risks to the coming year, right? The main question is travel going to react in the way it usually reacts to a fall in GDP? And so that matters in the way you think about your market. Now we did talk about different market segments, right? International, leisure, business, and group. The question is, urban versus resort, right? These sorts of differences. But there you can overlay that story of what's going on in the economy and our view that travel will continue to grow onto your destination. It still is meaningful, right? So if you are New York, right, it matters even though on the demand side you still haven't fully recovered, right? Because you're able to put stock in the probability that actually you probably have more upside because you're still far below. I think what we would significantly advise against is thinking that things are going to be permanently different. That is that New York's not going to continue to recover more quickly in the coming year because it's still farther behind. We think it will, actually. And urban markets that are still far behind, they're going to see greater growth than those resort markets that have already been full for the last 2 years. Right? But the big story matters for that just as much as if you're in Chicago or in Miami.
Hi. Just thinking about that slide with the wage growth on it rolling over, I just have a couple questions on that because I think that indicates a lot of kind of like what's going on under the hood of the economy. So is that being aided, or is like the labor supply emergency kind of over? Are we getting more labor supply into the economy finally, and is that helping moderate wage growth? And if wage growth is rolling over, do you think that gives us a more optimistic case for services inflation going forward as well?
Was that for you or for me?
I'm happy to do either. So the latter is certainly true. I mean, I think that I'm not particularly optimistic that you're going to see service sector wage growth fall so dramatically that it will, in fact, we'll get sort of a miraculous disinflation in the services excluding housing sector. The labor force has been a real conundrum for a lot of people. It's been shocking sort of how rigid that supply constraint is, despite the fact that we see some pretty serious weaknesses on household balance sheets. Typically that would drive people back in and start looking for work. And there's been a lot of great research out there showing some of the sort of structural barriers, I think, for folks coming back. I think it's a mixture of health reasons, it's a mixture of child care limitations, and then also you've got folks who've just aged out of the workforce. And so that was a challenge that the US had prior to the pandemic. This sort of general demographic trends were disfavorable or were headwinds to growing labor force participation. And I think as we sort of enter 2023, some of those longer structural cycles are more likely to rear their head.
Yeah. I mean, there are different measures of income, right? And so if you're looking at sort of weekly wage data, you've got both the total wages that get reported, and that's actually going to get juiced by the number of new jobs as well as hours worked. So in the latest data, you had actually an increase in the number of hours worked, which juiced the total weekly wages. The average weekly wages got pulled back because there were a lot more jobs added in restaurants. Right? So you've had a lot of things going on. So as I've talked to our U.S. chief economist about this, he just keeps coming back, just look at real disposable income. Like if you really want to know what's gonna kind of where this thing is going, the best thing is to look at that monthly series of inflation-adjusted, disposable, net after taxes income. All right, we got 2 minutes. Make them good.
Lightning round.
With so many people working from home, we've seen typical, shoulder days like Thursdays and Sundays perform extremely well. I'm curious, are you expecting any new or different travel trends to emerge in 2023 and beyond?
Particularly in regards to work from home?
Mm-hmm.
I think that that Longwoods question, and I think because I like that question so much, they're rerunning it in the current round because I really want to know what it is now. We'll find out in the next week or two how has that 34% gone up? Has it held? I think if it's held, we can be pretty well assured that opportunity of a traveler market that really didn't exist, certainly to the same degree that it does now, will matter in the coming year. Okay. All right, we have one. It's not, yeah.
It's just so obviously all economies are tied in at a global level, right? We've led globalism since the 70s, even before you say. I would like to see how you're looking at other economies in the globe and how that's affecting, thank you. But he can hear me. That's all that matters. But I would just like to know how you're taking all that into consideration. I mean, obviously we're talking about the US, but the US is dependent on a lot of other economies, right? And there's a lot of things happening. There's a war in Europe. There's lots of things going on right now that I just think will impact this, but how I don't know. And I don't know how your brains are sussing that out or inputting it into what you're just delivered here today.
Yeah, I can probably at least give one very concise answer, is that if you look at kind of what's going on in the global economy right now, you've got Europe, whose recession that was looking to be much more severe a couple of months ago than it is now, right? But still recession, right? And a number of reasons for that. Its ability to pivot as far as energy sources plus a warmer winter really helped in Europe. Meanwhile, you actually have some upside opportunity because China opened up earlier than most of us were expecting. And so one of the upside risks of the outlook is actually that Asia begins to accelerate more so. But that's just to say that it is absolutely one of the factors that we have to weigh in and is certainly part of our economic outlook for the US is that the global economy as well and the advanced economies will also experience recession.
I agree with that. I would note that the U.S. remains somewhat more insulated than Europe and other economies. I mean, we just don't trade as much as Europe. So I see, I think commodities prices are a channel of influence, but and obviously travel for this audience. But that has historically, I think, made that has been a boon to the U.S. economy, which is that in the face of global uncertainty, the U.S. has been able to sort of continue to grow. And I think that some of that sort of insular structural features of the economy will be helpful when there's so many weaknesses, particularly in Europe right now.
All right. Guys, thank you very much. It's great to be together again.
That was great.
Thank you both sincerely for that great interactive collaborative session. Give them a big round of applause, please. Really enjoyed that. Now, from 3 to 3:45, we have our liqueur coffee session, and that's in Ballroom A, and it is supported or sponsored by Amplify. By Data Sense, so thank you for that, greatly appreciated. And also, while you're having your coffee, please do stop by the exhibit booths and talk to some of the people there. We'd also really appreciate that. And you're due back here at 3:45 so we can get started on the last session of the day. So enjoy the coffee break. Thank you.